has so many companies that run huge portions of the internet infrastructure. We thought this would be a great place for us to have a contribution to take back to Berlin in the fall to talk about cyber safety, which is one of the key topics for the year. At my panel, as you can see, we're doing things a little differently here. We're gonna have a standing talking panel today. I'm going to go through, we'll do really quick introductions, but for more information, it's all in your pamphlet. We have Chris Betz, the CSO from CenturyLink. I'm going to get us started just with an introduction, and then we'll start questions.
Sure. Chief Security Officer for CenturyLink. For those of you who don't know CenturyLink, we're the second largest fiber backbone provider in the world. So we handle a massive volume of infrastructure and communications. Okay, sound off. Got it. So we provide a large volume of the network backbone, as well as we've got active practices in security, a large threat intelligence lab, and a bunch of other work to help secure that internet.
I'm Mohan. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Afilias. Afilias is an internet infrastructure company. We are domain name registry, the second largest in the world, and manage a bunch of top-level domain names. Probably the best-known ones that we run directly ourselves are .info and .pro and .mobi, but we also provide all of the technology and all of the services for other top-level domains such as .org.
I'm Allan Friedman, the Director of Cybersecurity Initiatives for NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. It's a genuine pleasure to be someplace where when I say NTIA, people I think know a little bit about us. We're the folks who handled the ICANN-IANA transition a few years ago, and my general counsel likes it when I casually drop into conversation that we're the President's advisor on telecommunications and internet policy. Most of my work focuses on identifying areas where the government can help catalyze a better and more efficient market response. So a lot of the security issues that we're going to be talking about today aren't things that the government can solve by fiat, but we can play a role in bringing folks together and trying to sort of help the market function a little better.
All right, so I'm Danny McPherson. I'm Executive Vice President and Chief Security Officer of Verisign. It's a little backwards for us. Our Chief Information Officer and some other folks actually roll up to me, so I'm responsible for all the IT operations and security, and that's kind of so they can have one head to shoot if there's a problem, I guess. I don't know. But you may be familiar with Verisign. We operate a large chunk of domain name infrastructure from some root server system infrastructure and publication functions in cooperation with ICANN and .com, .net, .gov, a few other things. Have a global footprint from that perspective, and yeah, so a large chunk of internet transactions rely on that on a daily basis. So.
And I'm Melinda Clem, the co-chair of IGF-USA and Vice President of Strategy for Afilias, and I'm your cruise director for today. We're going to talk about cyber safety and resiliency. We're going to cover 4 topics. First, we're going to talk about the threat landscape, so what the environment is out there that we actually have to try to keep safe. We're going to talk about the efforts that we take to mitigate those risks and the threats that we've identified. We're going to talk about incident disclosure, how it is that we start talking about and sharing information about various vulnerabilities or attacks. And we're also going to talk about best practices and norms. In a few minutes, the Slido session will be open online, sli.do, and if you click on the cyber safety room, you'll be able to enter questions directly. We'll also at the end give you a chance for those of you in the room to also raise your hand and take questions. So we're going to get started today just again talking about what the threat landscape is and what the current state of affairs. So the first question to my panelists is, how do you describe the threat environment from your perspective? And when you talk about that risk, how is that threat measured? What is the unit that you're using to talk about the threat and to either to quantify it in some way? Chris?
Good question, hard question. So I think for me, when I think about that threat, I see it growing in 2 dimensions. We spent this morning talking about data. Talking about how important data is, talking about how important privacy of data is. And it's not just businesses and governments and our citizens who recognize that. criminals recognize that as well. And so the desire for more data, the desire to access that data, the desire to disrupt the use of that data continues to grow. And the other end I look at is what's the volume of traffic that malicious actors get to operate in, leverage for their own use in case of denial of service, or hide in. And between 5G, IoT, and those other areas, I see the traffic volumes increasing. And so when I look at us systemically and structurally, I don't see anything that's really going to drive down the volume of malicious activity. I see the incentives continuing to increase, and I see the tools, the availability continue to increase. And so, you know, my metrics today more have to do with how I'm able to respond to it than anything else. You know, a year ago, we were taking down roughly 30 botnets every month. You know, not all botnets, some just mass malware. Today, we're up to nearly 60 every month. And so, you know, as we're out watching internet traffic, we're able to identify these mass malware events and take them down. And so part of the change has to do with how we've invested and how we're choosing to take actions to protect the internet as a whole. But part of it has to do with the increased prevalence. And so whether it's IoT botnets, DDoS attacks, those kinds of things, disrupting those attacks is incredibly important. And so, unfortunately, I see the threat landscape continuing to increase, and I don't see anything structural to stop that for the time being.
So I come at it from, in addition to the things that Chris, you've been saying, I look at this landscape over the next 5 or 10 years' time, and I think that probably the single largest threat is the lack of globally accepted norms of behavior. You have internet infrastructure that has been built and that has been created and that is being used for the public good for the most part. But now you have a clear evolution where there are both state and non-state actors who have weaponized all of this infrastructure. And if you look at state actors who are sophisticated, who have tremendous resources behind what they do, in the recent few years, you've seen state actors kind of leverage who appear to be non-state actors and be able to weaponize entire segments of the infrastructure. And folks like us who are managing and running infrastructure, of course, don't have any idea about it. We're stuck on the reactive end of that spectrum. And I view that as a significant global threat that we have to look to see how to solve. And that's part of the reason why I've been very interested in what the GCSC, the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, has been doing, because they're trying to come up with a norms package that says, here are a set of things that both nation states as well as non-state actors ought to be following. And if we don't get to the point where we agree on norms, or we have some mechanism to agree on norms, my fear is that every turn of technology is going to be leveraged first for offensive capabilities, and those of us who are on the defensive side are going to be stuck with the previous turn of technology.
So one of the ways that we've tried to sort of understand the threats in the Department of Commerce is to draw a distinction between distributed automated threats and more targeted threats. So on the distributed automated threats, and for those of you who have a wager, this will be the first time I'll mention the botnet report that came out a year ago, that sort of laid out, here is our vision of the current threats against distributed automated attacks. And I think one way to know about what drove that particular response, you can think of this as the government response to the famous Mirai attack. So we're all pretty familiar with this notion that, oh my goodness, a whole bunch of connected devices that we don't know who the hell made them, all of a sudden triggered perhaps the most well-known broad commercial internet outage and loss of core functionality that we've seen in a while. Everyone's fairly familiar with this Mirai attack. There's another perspective, though, which is to say, in the most well-publicized and visible attack against a core piece of infrastructure, DNS service, the harm was over in less than 24 hours, and the community instantly saw the one failure model that prevented greater resilience in the future. And if you're on the technical side, it's that we used to have our DNS records have a long TTL as part to defend against DDoS attacks, and now we realized, oh, that was actually part of the problem in recovering. So the community, which to say technical experts and private market actors, actually were quite resilient in this case. It was a serious outage, but quite resilient, and moving forward, that particular attack isn't going to be there. So I think that's important to keep that perspective as we talk about resilience, that the overall ecosystem, technology and market actors, and government on top if you want, have some amount of resilience. The second area that I think we're going to come up over today is more targeted attacks. Right, the random cut in the international cable versus knowing exactly which part of the infrastructure to inflict maximum damage against your target. And how do we model for that and plan resiliency around that? How do we detect that there's some ongoing attempt to subvert core parts of the internet? That's going to be something that we need to understand as well.
So yeah, from an evolving threat landscape, I probably, I guess in general, when I think about threat landscape, it's what do you care about? Where does it live? What do you have to do to protect it, right? And if you sort of tie that to internet infrastructure, the sort of things come to mind are the internet routing system, BGP, right, which is a web of trust. And I sort of refer to that as routing by rumor. So I tell you something and you choose to use it or not and choose to propagate it or not and so forth. There's no central authority today. And sort of makes that system highly resilient, but it also makes it very prone to errors that are hard to tell. Was it an error? Was it malicious? Or was it intentional or not? And then the next one's a domain name system, the DNS, right? Nobody uses IP addresses. Everybody types or encodes names typically for resilience and agility and other things. And it's a hierarchical structure with the transitive trust property. So basically, I rely on people I may not even be able to enumerate, and we see a lot of attacks on that. So other people say, if I want to attack example.com, I can attack root servers or .com or example.com directly, or I can attack this third party over here that enables that. And so those sort of systemic dependencies, in particular in the DNS, are really problematic. We've seen a rash of attacks. I think we're going to talk about that a bit more later. But targeting those, people say, hey, I don't have to directly attack that big entity. I can attack someone in their online supply chain, and if I do that, I can accomplish the same mission. So that's problematic. Web PKI, right, the padlock you used to see in your web browser, right? I mean, iPhone's probably got 180 certificate authorities embedded in a root trust store, and if any one of those is compromised, they're all compromised. So you're only as secure as the least secure of all those at the end of the day. So what does that mean for you from from an availability perspective? So I do think that all these things are the security starting to improve, but I think that with more things, more interconnected, with more sensitive data, at the end of the day, to Chris' point, the velocity, the volume, the firepower of an attacker, and what's in store if you lose that information, either the data itself or the availability of some piece of some service or information could be really, really problematic. And so I think the culmination of those is where it's really problematic today. That's the threat side, by the way. Maybe we'll get better later. I don't know.
So we've mentioned a lot of specific technologies as threats, and we've also talked about how the threats and the attacks have been increasing in both size and complexity. Although I think, I'm curious if we think that that is going to be the trend, and it's because of the technologies, and particularly things like IoT and having more devices and things on the internet. But a recent Akamai report noted, every quarter, grow. You see the bar graph growing and the size of the attack grows. There was recently one where it dropped just a little bit. Is that because do we think that will be the trend? Do we think that this was an anomaly, or are all of these different technologies driving to the bigger attacks?
So I think we have to be careful about the metrics that we're using. We're certainly looking at volume, total size of attacks, et cetera. But with Mirai and other things, what we're seeing is that you don't actually need to have one big thing that mounts a huge, massive attack. You can have a whole distributed network of small devices that each one of them can put a little bit at it, and it's an army of ants that brings down an elephant.
Oh, just and one more point again, speaking of sort of the true decentralization here, one of the standard things that we talk about whenever we see a giant DDoS attack is, are we using filtering? Can we look at our ISPs and say, hey, by the way, you're kind of responsible if someone upstream is pretending to be a bunch of other people and using it to attack an innocent third party. So ingress filtering, best control practices, wouldn't have helped in Mirai. It didn't have to actually use any of the fancy techniques that attackers have used in the past, just because there were so many potential nodes.
And that's why I think, to Ram's point as well, that we have to be careful about the metrics, because I think watching volume alone doesn't really communicate. I mean, the cyber attack business is all about effectiveness. And so the question is, what are the tools that you need in order to be effective? And yes, creating the biggest splash, great. Some people get, and there's certainly groups that get pride about that. What worries me more is the effectiveness. And so whether it be doing things, as Allan suggested, to help work with customers, have services in place for them to help protect against denial of service attacks, or, as I mentioned earlier, monitoring the thousands of botnets that we monitor every month and taking down as many of those as possible in order to disrupt them and prevent them from getting large. There's a slew of different techniques, but that's not going to stop the fact that you can go onto the dark web today and for probably the amount of money that you carry in your wallet, be able to order a denial of service attack against your friend because you want to compete with that person in gaming, says to me it's far too easy to do this today. And so I don't see anything that's really changing that model fundamentally.
Yeah, so I think, I'd certainly agree with that. I think that, in cybersecurity, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And if you're, sort of hawking cyberwares, or you're selling DDoS equipment or services or whatever, then certainly the up and to the right for DDoS attack volume or packets per second or transactions per second is really problematic. And the other side of that, by the way, is, in all my time in DDoS, probably been doing some DDoS stuff for either on the receiving end of a lot of it or selling that stuff for over 2 decades. And
not selling the attacks.
Not selling the attacks. I didn't do that side. No, certainly. But interestingly enough, a lot of the compliance and regulatory regimes out there, if the thing you care about is availability, which is typically what a DDoS attack is targeting, nobody's sort of got a regulatory model that says, hey, you must have availability of this level or this height or this amount of capacity for this service for these consumers, right? And that's sort of a big thing, right? And so if you look at that, if you look at our infrastructure, right, at Verisign, it's, what's our transaction servicing capacity, right? At the end of the day, I need bandwidth and I need packets per second and the ability at the processing layer to be able to compute and to respond to people that are consuming our services. And so we've got some threshold well above biggest attacks that you want to be able to provision your infrastructure. But generally from a large DDoS attack perspective, I suspect that the biggest attacks we see today are only a function of the ability of the target to actually count that attack and and their upstreams to provide that bandwidth to them, right? I don't think it's a firepower problem from the attacker. I think they're probably overwhelmed upstream in most cases, if that's an issue. And so I think it's kind of the numbers are one thing, but if you also worry about availability, I think when I look at availability of our infrastructure again and think about the threat landscape, there are certain keyboards where you need 2-party systems or other things so that, one keystroke as opposed to 50 terabits of capacity could cause the same amount of problem. And so is it a volumetric thing, or is it that one targeted attack that could be problematic? So I think it doesn't tell the whole story, but it definitely tells. It's really important to look at those metrics, but if you operate infrastructure, you probably ought to be looking at both sides of that spectrum.
Melinda, one of the other things that I've been worrying about in recent times has been that we're talking about taking down botnets, this model of you identify the threat and then you go and you take them down. But if you look at devices that are used in life and death situations that have been compromised and that are now being used to attack your infrastructure, take traffic cameras, for example, right? You get a network of traffic cameras and you have them infected, they have high bandwidth going in and out, and they're now part of a botnet. You can't realistically expect to take them down, right? And then from the attacker's point of view, then the game is about who can actually go grab control of that network, because you know that that network is almost never updated. The software is not updated. The vulnerability is going to remain, and the authorities who are running it are unlikely to actually shut them down.
Well, and Ram, you're hitting on what I think is a couple of the key themes. And when I talk about takedown, by the way, I should have been clear. I'm talking about preventing communications with the command and control network.
Right.
So the inability to take these, tell these things to take a malicious action, as opposed to shutting down the traffic cameras, because that would be clearly very bad. But you know, there has been a bunch of conversation about hackback, and what you're bringing up is exactly the reasons why that is so dangerous as a trend and as a theme, because attackers understand this and they take advantage of infrastructure in order to that is compromised, in order to both mask their intent and their direction, but as well as to cause any hackback to have collateral damage. Lastly, it's why I think that, you know, as you touched on with the equipment manufacturers and the software updating, there's some critical responsibility that consumers and producers of equipment have that is in the best position to change some of the fundamental models that we face. And without things that help us get secure by default and updated by default, we're left fighting a rearguard action and facing up and being reactive, rather than having that security proactively up front, the way you suggested.
That was a great discussion. We touched a little bit on the sophistication of the attacks and something a little bit more targeted. So I think it'd be useful for us to educate our audience a little bit on this new topic, very fun to say, DNS espionage. The concept of DNS hijacking. It's got another name. I'm certainly sea turtle. I'm sure there's no zoological or marine biology publicist who did that, but we'll put that aside for a second. So let's talk about what sea turtle is and what lessons the industry should take from that. Actually, we'll ask Danny to start this, and I think he could probably give us just a 2-minute overview of what sea turtle was and how that worked.
Sure. So, yeah, one of the misnomers, one of the things that frustrated me with a lot of the sea turtle reporting is it was DNS hijackings, and people assumed it was the DNS infrastructure itself that was vulnerable. And the reality was it was account credentials and takeover at the account layer, the same thing that may occur to your bank account. And so I think there were, you know, in general, what happened is someone enumerated what enables a country code TLD, for example, and what are the name servers that enable that to work on the internet. And they said, hey, these guys don't have basic security controls in place. It's pretty easy to compromise them. And if I do that, then I can attack this entity that they help enable the internet presence for. And so I think if you operate critical infrastructure, you ought to have a basic level set of controls in place to make sure that that, you know, at least sort of you know, first order primitive attack mechanisms for account takeover don't impact your organization or the many organizations that rely on you. One of the things that was interesting in the first phase of the DNS espionage attacks is that a couple of the folks that were attacked and compromised provide DNS resolution services for, you know, tens of TLDs, right? And so if you compromise them, of course, you can impact any of the organizations that they provide that for. And then what these folks were doing, which was reasonably sophisticated, is they would do something called a pulsing attack, where they didn't want to have a long, persistent compromise because it's easily detected. And so they would attack someone, they would steal some credentials and maybe establish persistence inside of an infrastructure. And then they would disable it so it was hard to be detected, and then they would come back and do it again later. And so I think the lesson that I saw there, quite frankly, is there were some pretty fundamental best practices that should have been implemented, like multi-factor authentication and registry lock services and things like that that probably should have been done to help mitigate those threats. Unfortunately, it's not as sexy as some people have made it. The implications of it are really bad, but quite frankly, those attacks have been happening for 2 decades. What else would I say about that? I think that, that's sort of the biggest thing, and understanding who's in your attack surface, right? That transitive trust thing I talked about earlier, understanding who those name servers are that make your servers available is super important to your availability and security on the internet. So you need to make sure that, that's in your attack surface enumeration, and you're putting controls in place to mitigate threats against that. I think, is that enough? I'll move on, and maybe I'll come back and we'll pass it on to Ram.
So I thought the interesting thing from the DNS espionage and the sea turtle attacks, this is one of the things that in the security profession you look at, right? You need a good problem and you need good visibility for folks on the receiving end to actually start taking action, right? It took the Michelangelo virus for companies to sit there and say, got to get antivirus as a regular thing in every computer in the organization, right? So to some extent, I mean, if you were to look at the silver lining on DNS espionage and sea turtle, et cetera, that you could say that's the silver lining. But what it really underscored is what Danny was saying. The fundamental problem of credential compromise, it's been well documented. It's not a new problem. What is different? What really changed? What changed was that the smarts of the attackers, they became better focused and better targeted on which institutions to inflict this to identify and then inflict the problem on, right? And when those organizations failed, you had, Danny was saying tens of TLDs, but tens of TLDs underlying that are thousands and tens of thousands of names underlying that, right? So it's the amplification factor that I think on the attacking side, they've figured out a much better way of coming at it. You take a small swath of critical infrastructure providers and you probe them and you find the dozen that are not up to snuff and you get them, and now you've got access to a whole pile underneath it, right? And I think that is probably the biggest lesson coming out of it is if you're a regulator, if you're a government, you ought to look at who are really the critical providers, not just the ones that you know of, the big guys, the guys supplying fiber, et cetera, but there are third-party providers who provide a critical function, and in many cases, they follow practices that belong more in the last century than in this one.
And I think Danny may have mentioned it when we were talking earlier about this, but it all comes down to another variation on a supply chain attack.
Yeah.
This is your service supply chain, and I know I would not be doing my job if I didn't go and ask each one of my vendors for how they were doing security and evidence of what they were doing for that security. And I think there's a significant need for that. Part of the challenge as you think about that, especially from a policy space, is that it's easy to think about setting up rules and regulations to do that. And in some cases like this, that'll help you get past the egregious, gosh, they should have known about this 2 decades ago. In other cases, the ways that we need to maneuver in order to face the next generation of threats and the current generation of threats require me to add new questions, evaluate those pieces differently. And so I think there's this responsibility for us to be able to ask those questions and answer that. And I need to be able to ask them not only about what they're doing, but also how they evaluate their supply chain. I just started asking those questions in the relatively recent past. And so I want to know not just about their security practices, but their supply chain practices. And those should be transitory so that in theory, you should be able to get across the depth of the supply chain, or at least that's the goal. But I think that's still an evolving practice for us.
So some of these practices we're talking about, and it's rightly a technical panel, so we're talking about technology and how you would access a server and do these things. What do you think is it all technical, or is there an element of individuals unwittingly getting compromised? Are you going to be asking your vendors as you're going through their security protocols, the steps that they're taking to mitigate sort of the personal hack and a person inadvertently giving away their credentials? I leave my badge, or I let someone come through the building and see something. Does that play any factor in this yet? Isn't that increasing?
I expect every organization of a sufficient size or a combination of organizations, just statistically, they're going to get compromised. I think the latest statistics I saw was that somewhere between 5 and 15%, depending on the source, of people will, when they get a phishing email, an email that's asking you to pretending to be a legitimate website and give up your credentials, 5 to 15% of people will give up their credentials or download and run the file that was attached. And with training, the best organizations in the world get down to 5%. And what that means is that you're still dealing with, somewhere between 10 and 20 emails. You're going to be successful getting a single point compromise. And so the question is, how do they run their critical infrastructure? How do they detect those instances? What are the things that they're doing to mitigate against the attacks? And how do they respond and set themselves up for that? Because unfortunately, it's far too easy to fool people who honestly, rightfully are paying attention to other things other than, is this email legitimate? Because they've got other problems to solve.
So the training is actually you can even do one better, which is if you're responsible for security, you can game your own training against your people so that when it's time to get a bigger budget, you can make the numbers of people who make mistakes go up so that you get a bigger budget. And then when it's time for your review to come, you can have 2 months of improvements so you can demonstrate your value to the organization.
Allan, will you come work for me? I'm missing an opportunity here.
But I think we are making progress as a security community. So usually a Twitter dogpile is nothing to celebrate. But recently, at a very high-profile technical conference, someone was captured on Twitter saying, someone was captured giving a speech, and his line was, "There's always going to be some idiot clicking the link." And everyone in the security community piled on saying, no, they're not idiots, they're humans. It's your fault as a security person for having an infrastructure that allows a single click to break your infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. So I think on one hand, we're making progress as a community, understanding that users aren't idiots, they're users. They're not the enemy, they're people that we need to build infrastructure for. The challenge is, how do you manage that risk in a efficient marketplace? So how can I work with Danny's company to make sure that we understand this? I don't have perfect answers for it. Danny can provide one. I'm not an ops guy for the US government, but I want to just mention a recent program that DHS just rolled out, which is they are now keeping an eye on all .gov domains. And so if there's a change, they know whose beeper needs to go off to make sure that that change was supposed to happen. That's how an organization can actually take advantage of the fact that, hey guys, this is the internet. We have lots of data. Let's use it in as close to real-time feedback loops as we can.
Yeah, so back to sea turtles and .gov, right? There was an emergency directive from US Gov and said, hey, do this list of things. So I guess in the spirit of never waste a good crisis, we collectively all suck less now because that happened, right? So, I guess that's sort of one side of it. I think the other side is, one of the other things I said, we certainly do a ton of security awareness training, right? We have metrics on that. We test, everybody about every quarter for phishing and other attacks. But, we also start from the premise that assume you're compromised. And one of my key metrics for my operational teams are, how long did it take you to mitigate that threat, right? In other words, to at least quarantine it and make sure you understand it's contained, and then work your way back to do all the triage and forensics and everything you need to do. And so, from, I think, anybody that operates infrastructure, that's probably one of your key metrics today is, how long does it take you to respond? Because we know people are going to do things. We can teach them, but we can't understand it for them. And so, work your way back from that and just assume they're going to be compromised, and make sure you've got the ability to detect those things and the controls and whatnot in place. So security awareness, and then security automation and continuous monitoring, something NIST and other folks have put a lot of time into helping people understand. And it's pretty serious. You definitely got to do that today. So.
On the tactical side, Melinda, everybody here has a bank account or something like that where they've asked you now in this idea of having another factor, a second factor of authentication, et cetera. They ask you, we're going to ask you 3 security questions that only you know the answer to, and provide that. And you have questions like, what was the name of your high school mascot, right? Now, how hard do you think that is to find out these days? Right? So if you're really looking at providing answers to those kinds of questions, it's a very small tactical thing, but make them up. Make up those answers. There is no requirement that you have to provide the real name of your mother, the maiden name of your mother. There is no requirement that you have to provide the street that you grew up on when you were in 2nd grade, right? But they ask you these questions, you provide the truth in those things, and the truth of those things can then be found out, because we're all leaving a very long digital trail, and there's ever more dots being connected. So, in those areas, it's actually good to go make up these supposed facts about you, store them, because if you don't have them, you won't know what you made up. But find a way to do that, but that's a pretty easy tactic to try and lead people off the wrong track.
While we're
So
giving
my
general
thing-
security advice, who's using a password manager? All right, everyone else, your homework. Go look up password managers. Use them, please.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to know that my joke that I've been doing for the last 4 years, that I ascribe myself as being a 75-year-old woman, is actually a security tactic as well. So let's keep drilling into this a little bit more, and let's talk about another tool that's in the infrastructure providers' toolbox is encryption, right? So the concept that data follows a path and it is encrypted, the entire path, to anyone except the intended recipient. 2 days ago, Attorney General Barr was speaking at Fordham University, and he noted that increased encryption actually, in his opinion, increased encryption actually weakens security and is a threat to Americans. So I'd like your opinions on that, and your thoughts on keeping encryption intact as opposed to allowing backdoors to, say, the government.
I of course, have no comment on that, other than to speculate that perhaps that speech may not have actually gone through the interagency process.
I'm a fan of encryption.
I think encryption, makes us more secure.
You want to round us out for a unanimous vote here?
Yeah, look, I think it's, if you have a national security hat on, it sounds like a really attractive thing to say, if only I had that back door, I could, solve these various security problems. I could find out who the bad guys were. I could find out where the next terrorism thing is happening, etc. But the real fallacy there is this assumption that these back doors are going to be accessible only to the good guys. And who is the good guy?
Danny's a good guy. He just
I'll
raised
say
his
a
hand.
bit more. I'm sorry. I was trying to be clever. No, I couldn't agree with Ron more. You can't put a hole in that, because all of a sudden that back door is going to become the target, right? That's the primary target everyone's going to want. And certainly the people that are most concerned with not having other people have encryption, encrypt their own stuff, certainly, right? And so for good reason. And so I just think in general, our general mode of operation is encrypt everything everywhere, and and have good key management practices, and make sure you monitor those for for various malicious activity or anomalies, and work your way back, right? I think that the backdoor model, that whole thing is really problematic for that reason.
And I think that given the global nature and the lack of consistency in terms of the rule of law, different types of governments, the global nature of equipment and governments leads to a very, very dangerous space, and adds an element of complexity where backdoors are an unsolvable solution. They don't work. So I think there's good data to show that over time encryption saved us from more than it's cost us. But I think there's room for a healthy debate on if there are better ways to solve the problem.
I mean, look at the worked example of what's happened to trust and certificate authorities, right? Once you got to the point where you could just create any certificate and self-certify, and then you have the entire ecosystem that depends upon trusted authorities goes away, right? And yes, there's a padlock that seemed to tell you that your data is safe, but your data may be safely going to the wrong hands now.
So we've had a healthy discussion here and a lot of good recommendations for some best practices. I'll give you each a chance, though, to reflect now on the last 30 minutes and say, if there was just one thing that you could encourage every other operator out there to do, what would it be?
I'll take the first shot. I think collaboration's key. So when I talk to other infrastructure providers, the collaboration that we have to go through in order to identify, target, and disrupt malicious actors is crucial. Because while I'd love to be in a place where we can all have preventative security controls and not have to respond, right now we need to respond as well. And so making sure that we have the right relationships and that we're working together operationally and actively to disrupt as much as possible, we've got the power to do that. And so I think that is the biggest thing that I ask for service providers.
No, yeah, I think that's a great one. The wisdom outside of the room, and certainly the real-time context accumulation, that kind of thing. If I had to give one, sort of besides the collaboration side, because I think that's the key, is understand what enables what you care about and where it lives. Right? I mean, it sounds simple, but in this day and age, it's not easy, right? The routing system, the transitive trust properties of the infrastructure, where are your keys for your iCloud account, right? Where does your password management data live, right? Where's the content at, and what enables access to that, right? I kind of laugh. I work with an entity all the time that's responsible for coordinating some emergency response stuff, and a lot of the time they're like, look, if there's an emergency, don't worry about it, we'll send you an email. Or like, well, you won't if email doesn't work. And so avoiding those circular dependencies is really important. And a lot of effort goes into that, right? But making sure you sort of take a holistic approach and enumerate those systemic dependencies and try and minimize those is really important, either in the face of an attack or certainly some emergency or natural disaster or something to that effect as well.
So from a policy perspective, we spend a lot of time trying to understand what supports this collaborative model. Right? The vast majority of security issues that we understand are currently being addressed in as much as they can be in multi-stakeholder organizations and industry groups. There's the North American Network Operators Group, there's APWG, there are a whole bunch of other long acronym organizations where the right people get together and say, hey, we need to solve this. So what could be government roles? One is sort of identifying and promoting these, making sure that we can safeguard them. NTI sort of works very hard to do that. Two, understanding that to support this, there's often a little bit of a trade-off that we have to make. I would argue that accountability and transparency often are in tension. And if we want greater transparency, if we want the ability to understand our threats in real time and have a better post-mortem following serious cybersecurity incidents, it means we need to be a little more tolerant of mistakes. And there's different cultures in this. So in many areas of national security, and for example, in military aviation, every incident has 2 investigations. The first one starts with what happened, what went wrong, and that is a blameless investigation. And only after that is done do you have a completely sandboxed, all right, who's asked we nailed to the wall? And that happens separately. So understanding that. And the final thing, where again we've made a lot of progress, but this is something that we need to promote globally, is this emphasis on coordinated and decentralized vulnerability disclosure. One way to think about it is, How do we make sure that everyone in the world knows what to do when someone knocks on their door and says, your system is flawed, and you're putting yourself at risk, you're putting your users at risk? At the advanced tech world, we've been doing this for a long, long time. We're still learning. So as vulnerabilities affect many, many vendors, Spectre meltdown, there's no perfect way to do it, but there's some great guidance. The Forum on Incident Response and Security Teams First has some great guidance on multi-party disclosure that we developed in concert with some work at NTIA. And also, this is something that I think the United States and tech companies can help bring to the rest of the world, where there's often a natural inclination to route everything through a centralized government hub. And really, it's about empowering those who are running the technical infrastructure to want to know about things as soon as possible so they can fix them.
I'd say that one of the biggest challenges is figuring out what to throw away. Because you have such a huge amount of data, and in the world that we're living in, and as infrastructure providers, the amount of data that is coming in, even with proper data mining and proper machine learning systems, you still have a huge amount of signal, what appears to be signal coming in. And being able to discern and determine the patterns in that, and then deciding which pieces of this data you can just throw away and forget about it, and which pieces to keep. That is really what I think is going to separate companies and countries going forward from those who don't have that capability. I think that is really the next generation of education and learning that has to happen. How do you determine which is really the signal, and how can you validate that what you believe is signal is really a signal?
Very helpful solutions. Let's migrate into a discussion about the more specific efforts that folks take to mitigate these sort of attacks. Let's start, at 10,000 feet and just talk about what the philosophy of your response is. And is there, as the attacks change, how does the response change? Is it just that we have to get bigger and bigger because the attacks are getting bigger? Are they getting more sophisticated, so we just get smarter and more lean? Is it a hybrid of the two? Thoughts? Danny, we'll start at the end.
Yeah, I think it's a hybrid. I think that, interestingly, right, I guess, is, certainly as firepower increases, if you care about the availability of a service, you have to have some way to absorb a large-scale attack. And ideally, to Ram's point, to delineate signal from noise and scrub the bad stuff out and keep the good stuff and preserve the availability of that service. I think that's certainly a big part of, this. I would also say, though, is that I think we're fairly, the architecture of the internet is interesting in that it's fairly open, right? And that's allowed, permissionless innovation, that phrase we all know, right? And the problem with that is that I'll tell anyone in the world can ask for the name of some entity in my infrastructure, and I'll tell them that name and resolve it just like I'll resolve it for the authorized people to access that infrastructure. So why do I do that? Why do I disclose the coordinates of something that may not be accessible to them? And so I think getting smarter about how we architect infrastructure, like with software-defined networks and some contextual name resolution and things like that, sort of will enable folks to better minimize their attack surface and minimize what's out there. So it's like understand what's out there and then minimize it and scope it to only who should see it, assuming you can predetermine that is a pretty important thing. And then I think a lot of people distribute content and services and other things really, really broadly to improve the performance, minimize the latency, improve the performance for end users. And that allows you to absorb really large-scale attacks and topologically localize things, and that's a really healthy thing. But it certainly causes some challenges with keeping that information fresh and so forth, and particularly when you have cryptography involved with it and time to live on various things. And so I think sort of the culmination of that's important. I would go back again to the what do I care about? Where does it live, right? A fast fact for, Internet Governance Forum community is that 30% of the CCTLDs in the world don't have a single in-country authoritative server for their infrastructure. right? Not one, right? So if you think about that, and if they're segmented or there's a fiber cut or multiple fiber cuts or whatever the challenge is, right, then obviously they're going to have a problem with even internal operations or emergency response inside of their infrastructure. So you got to enumerate and understand what you care about and where it lives, and then how you either keep it available or protect it in the face of some kind of attack.
So it didn't make the final draft of the botnet report, but one of my favorite citations is RFC 3514, just by Steve Belvin, and it's the call to say, let's extend the IP packet header for an evil bit. And just the rule is that if you're evil, you set it to 1, and otherwise you set it to 0, and then we can just configure your network. If you want to be an open, permissive network to allow evil, that's great. Otherwise, obviously that's not how the internet works, and we don't want an internet where someone makes an arbitrary judgment that says, packet evil, throw it out, throw it out, throw it out. There are certain defined global recognized standards where we can recognize this is malicious types of traffic, but we don't want to easily bucket between all of this is evil or not. So, what are the approaches? As we said, there aren't one-size approach. Volumetric attacks, on one hand, we're now, right in 2019, if you're facing volumetric risks, then the answer is you use the existing market-based defenses, right? You don't just put a host on the internet circa mid-90s. That's not how the internet of today works. You use a CDN. And we're getting better at making it easier to do that sort of thing so that you don't have to be one of the world's most mature organizations to do that. One of the things that grew out of the botnet report is an industry group called the Council to Secure the Digital Economy, CSDE, which has started to write playbooks so that organizations can say, oh, when I'm worried about this, let me have the checklist of what I need at certain points in the community. Another group, I believe it's the Cybersecurity Coalition, has worked with NIST to extend the NIST framework to explicitly look at DDoS attacks so that we know how to prevent ourselves. So I think there's better work that we can do as at least not the bleeding edge of attacks, but the attacks that have become more common. We can say, all right, you got to be, today, 2019, you got to be this tall to ride the internet, and here's how you can get yourself to that level.
And your reports
I was going to add one thing so I think an important point he's making is if you operate global infrastructure, especially resolution infrastructure, naming infrastructure, you don't want to be in the business of picking winners and losers at the end of the day, whether it's an organization, a nation state. So you got to make sure your controls have other sort of steam valves you can turn if that occurs. And I think that's a really, really important point. So.
Yeah, and the other thing I would mention is that we're talking about some very sophisticated technologies here, but some of the reports that NTIA has put out remind folks that run less sophisticated architectures but are still important and still have security risk of some real good basics. Like you guys have done a great job of talking about patching and updates and things of that nature, and those are good reminders to the community at large.
And just to continue to pat ourselves on the back. Thank you for that. Right? Where should the government step in? Should we be telling global level infrastructure providers, hey, let me get up to speed with your leading engineers, go past them? And that's not my role. And by the way, we know that you're working with engineers at DHS and NIST to understand some of the bleeding edge attacks globally. There are engineers who actually sit at government research labs. That's wonderful. But really, it's how do we protect and allow some of the other actors that aren't as sophisticated to make sure that they can take advantage of the tools that the community has collectively developed.
You could classify this as cyber hygiene. Just as there is hygiene in real life that has life-changing consequences and life-saving consequences, I think we have to start thinking about that in a very similar light in the online space. And this is something where I think governments have a key role to play, where if states actually started to talk about advocacy of proper cyber hygiene, define what cyber hygiene is, and this has done a great job in that area, but define it and then start working on how to reward cyber hygiene. I think that if nothing else, just that would raise the total health of and the resiliency of this infrastructure that we all depend upon.
And I think we touched on it a few times, but the range of solutions, everything from big multinationals to consumers, requires different and nuanced solutions. It's really easy to make security complex. And it's much harder to make it a seamless part of what people do every day. And yet I think that's the effort that we're all part of, is making security more seamless, more integrated in what we do, connecting in everything from the sophisticated threat intelligence and as well as the most sophisticated technology we can find, but really packaging that up into a seamless solution so it's not bolt-on complex, it's seamless and secure. And that doesn't alleviate the need for good cyber hygiene. That doesn't alleviate the need for good practices, but balanced together, it really helps us get someplace. And so I think, at least when I start thinking about that at a really high level, it's how do I identify the different ecosystems? How do I help them solve their problems? And how do I do it in a way that is seamless so that those folks are not working around the security solution? I had a conversation with somebody earlier today who was telling me about their company preventing them from sending PowerPoints over a certain size. And so instead, they went and have everything stored on Google Drive and send it from their Gmail. It's these kinds of security practices where it causes too much friction, makes things too hard. And so I think the challenge for us as infrastructure providers is how to make security part of the experience rather than a separate step that has to be worked around.
Although I would note that I think it's less a security thing than a common decency thing to have slides that are extremely long in length. It's a good business hygiene. Yeah. So it's actually a good segue into the next question and how we're being good actors and what that looks like. I want to talk a little bit about the concept of hacking back. For those of you not familiar, let me give this to you by example. If you're sitting in a company and you're under attack, the concept of hacking back says, I'm going to go find that person. I'm going to trace where they're coming from and keep going and going until I find them, and then maybe do something to stop them and thwart the attack. Now, that sounds to some people reasonable on the surface, but if you think this through, the reason this becomes complex is that it does become a global problem. Not everybody is sophisticated enough to know that they've traced something suddenly outside of their country border, and that act of trying to thwart an attack might be considered an act of aggression. And then suddenly we've got the State Department involved and lots of other trouble. So the question to the panel is, have your organizations thought about hacking back, and have you developed any positions on this?
So I'm going to jump in with a no comment officially from Commerce Department, but the one thing I do want to say is I've talked about this issue a lot over, probably close to 10 years. I have met exactly one serious security person who understands what modern global attacks look like, who actively defends the idea of hacking back, like a professional security person. And he's a troll. So he just does it for the lulz. But everyone else I know in security who has thought through this, who has done both active attacks as well as understands the blue team side of things, says this is a non-starter.
So I think that, it's certainly interesting. I think, from a corporate perspective, it's leave that to professionals, right? And don't break any laws or whatnot. And certainly, on the front end of that, it's kind of, attribution is really hard in cyberspace. So, what are you doing anyway? It's probably a compromised system that whoever's attacking you is using to attack you with in the first place. So where's the adversary behind that, right? That's sort of, an important side of that. I kind of am a big fan of cyber deterrence that my government supports, or any government in any jurisdiction where we operate, where, people are discouraged from attacking because there will be professionals involved in some kind of retaliation, whatever that means. Maybe it's not a hack, but who knows? Hopefully it's not a missile or something. But, so I think that's really important. I do, I would sort of, highlight one thing though. A lot of, most of the DDoS attacks out there are probably launched by botnets, and botnets are usually made up of compromised systems, and so they're probably victim systems themselves. So what are you going to do, right? Sometimes it's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Way back in the day when we did early DDoS research, and we would get visibility in the command and control infrastructure, and we'd see them attack someone. We would log in and turn the attack off on all the systems and just stop it, right? And then what people started doing is they would take the command and control infrastructure out, and you wouldn't be able to even turn the attack off, so the systems would never stop attacking it until they were rebooted or disconnected. Some carriers with lots of subscribers, like CenturyLink, maybe, I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but do some sophisticated things where they try and notify their users that they're compromised, and you probably ought to clean up your system and maybe quarantine them in some way that doesn't break things that would get them in trouble, but it gets pretty slippery. One of the things I don't like is I don't like a lot of the sort of the domain-based takedown stuff for big botnets, where you're not dealing with the end system, you're just dealing with the command and control channel. You're not making the command and control channel available, but the end systems are still compromised. I'm going to give you an example why. Is that there was this thing known as Configure 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and 1 million plus hosts were impacted by this botnet. And then a lot of people took a lot of time, a lot of effort to make sure they took over the hundreds of thousands and ultimately millions of domains that were involved in command and control infrastructure for maintaining this very sophisticated botnet. And they kind of kept it under wraps. And then somebody wrote some destructive malcode in some ransomware that was called WannaCry, and it exploited that configure compromised host, the same vulnerabilities, and established local persistence and attacked everything else on the local networks and further propagated and broke everything. Now, if 15 years ago we had just broken those initially impacted systems, that would have never happened, right? So it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Where if you're dealing with the symptom up here or kind of putting a Band-Aid on a headache, those systems are still down there and compromised, and they could be used as a foothold to cause a lot of problems. And so I think hygiene of the infrastructure in aggregate and having responses to those things is really, really important. So, and maybe just give Chris an opportunity to plug what you guys do at CenturyLink.
Now, plug or not, I think from a hackback standpoint, I think we're all, well, I haven't heard from Ram yet, but at least 3 of us are in agreement that hacking back.
Ram's going rogue.
I'm that troll you was talking about.
Hey, at least you're a security expert, a serious security person in the knowledge box, so I'm not sure I'm up there yet. I don't think hacking back's useful. I do think disruption of malicious activity is incredibly useful. And to your point, I don't think it can be incomplete. I think we do need to and so yes, we are amongst the companies that when we identify compromised systems, we will go notify companies. In fact, yeah, we're working on, as we picture up the best of the threat intelligence that we can get from our outside partners and our feeds, as well as the best threat intelligence we can get by taking advantage of the global network that we have and looking for patterns of malicious activity. We're able to notify those victims and help them rectify the situation, hopefully before things comes bad. At the same time, there's a bunch of different methods of disruption, whether it be when something's not under attack, disrupting the ability to command and control the bots, which could potentially include the takedown of a command and control, though DNS only becomes, as you said, a weak tool when used all by itself. But also whether it's work with law enforcement or other methods for, financial methods or other ones to help disrupt the malicious activity that the actors are taking. And so that to me is an interesting place for us to be. But hack back is far too risky, and it's not something that we'd consider. I think there is a lot of opportunities, though, for disruption, and that comes back to that collaboration and that partnership to identify and disrupt that malicious activity.
I want to let Ram respond in a moment, but first just on the notion of sort of testing. This is not something that the United States government would do or indeed could do, but our colleagues in Japan at the Ministry of Information and Communication, MIC, have a very interesting project going on where they are scanning the entire civilian, commercial, residential IP space in Japan, looking for IoT devices, and if they find one, they are trying to enter default credentials. And if they can successfully do that, this is the government, then they will notify the ISP to notify the customer. This is not something that I think any US government entity would try or indeed has the authority to do, but it is going to be interesting. I've heard some preliminary private results out of this exercise. It'll be interesting when they're able to talk about it much more broadly.
Yeah, so all the joking aside, I think hackback or active cyber defense or other clever ways, clever words really mask the fact that that is actually offense. That is not defense. And as Danny and others have said, the collateral damage, attribution is hard, collateral damage is significant. In the GCSC, that's actually one of the norms that the GCSC has put out that says, that actually actively pushes back against this concept of hackback. Leaving just the pure technology pieces aside, on hackback, I also think we ought to be, and folks who are even thinking about this, ought to be thinking about, if you're not a state actor, if you're not a professional, if you're not a state actor, you're a non-state actor, and you are engaging in some kind of hackback, you might be considered an agent of that state, and you might expose yourself, your employees, folks like that, to actions from professionals on the other side. And those actions from professionals are not fun things to be on the receiving end of.
We spent a lot of time today talking about the actual attacks, and we've mentioned sharing information and some venues that we do that today. So let's dive into that a little bit more and talk about incident disclosure and reporting. Generally speaking, we're all smarter the more that we know, but as Ram just said, you've got to be very careful about what it is that you expose, because you could inadvertently be exposing vulnerabilities. So the next question is, what type of threat information should we be sharing, and what are the venues that are best, in addition to the ones we've mentioned already today, what venues, and is there a role for the USG?
Sure, yeah. So there's sort of two levels. One is a general collaboration level, I think, where sort of higher level things you may share. It's like, hey, we're generally seeing this, or here's a trend, or might publish a report or something, who knows. But then, there's sort of the more operationally oriented ones where I may share information bilaterally with another party I see that's impacted, or a source of something, so forth. May share information with a government, like, for example, DHS under CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, I think, and gives us some protections, and also has some privacy protections in that. We're super careful about the privacy side of this. And then, there's sort of, and we usually, when it's things like that, like a unique DDoS attack or something, right? We say, hey, here's what we saw, and here's why we think it matters to you. And, you should probably have this on your radar, that kind of thing. But, and then there's sort of sharing indicators of compromise, like nouns in particular, like an IP address or a domain name or a file hash or something like that. And that's the one where I think is really valuable. It's probably the most actionable, right? I mean, when somebody gives me a 100-page report and in the appendix is one IP address that I need to do something with, and it's not even automated, I'm like, all right, I don't care about the other 99 and a half pages unless something happens with that actor, and then, yeah, I need that information, right? And so, but I think that one of the challenges we have today is that, again, if you look at most of the indicators that are shared, particular IP address and domain names, nobody ever pulls anything back out of that system. So it's like the TSA no-fly list or something, right, where as an operator, my highest end next generation firewall infrastructure probably has 250,000 smart filters where I can do reactive stuff with a filter, right? And then I front end that with something that says, okay, I can block 20 million or 50 million things, but you're not going to get the same amount of agility and so forth, right? And nobody ever comes to me and says, hey, take those 50,000 things out, right? Or the provenance on the information that's shared with me. Where did it come from, and how was it obtained, and what's the life cycle related to that? Nobody ever pulls anything back out of that. So just big cumulative pile of stuff that I can't really take out because I don't know when I'm going to be able to. So it's kind of scorched earth, right? IP address, domains, all those things. And so I think that provenance in information sharing at the indicator layer is really, really important, I guess, is what I would say related to that.
I'd say one of the things is, when you're a company, you're an organization, or you're a government, and somebody has disclosed to you that there is a vulnerability, and you patch it, especially if it's a significant vulnerability. I think it's important to make sure that that there is some level of disclosure about the vulnerability, and not just focus on the patching. And I think in many organizations, and in some cases in some governments as well, the idea becomes, we'll patch it, but now we've got a hole that we can access, right? And I think that's actually a bad idea. To me, that has both ethical considerations, but it's got practical considerations as well. If you're patching and you're protecting your infrastructure, you have to keep in mind that this infrastructure is an interconnected infrastructure, and you are, at the end of the day, going to be only as strong as the weakest link here.
It's a good segue to an effort that I'm currently leading at NTIA, which isn't explicitly about information infrastructure. It's about the broader software world, and it's an initiative on software component transparency. So the very quick pitch is, you go to the store, you buy a piece of candy, comes with a list of ingredients. Maybe most of the time you don't care until there's someone in your life with a food allergy. And then it's very important that that data is available and accessible in a way that you can use. Similarly, when we buy a 10-ton diesel generator, it's going to come with something called a bill of materials, which is, here's a list of every nut and every bolt so that you can perform maintenance on it. But if you buy a diesel generator 10 tons today, it's probably going to be connected to the internet. And what you don't know is what's in the software stack that's operating that. We're not suggesting you have to turn over source code, but the third-party components. Is the crypto library up to date? Is the operating system up to date? Is the network stack patched? That's really important so that you know it. And important to Ram's point, it gives you some actionable risk-based intelligence even if a patch isn't available, right? If there's something that needs 5 nines of uptime, so you can't patch it and there's a critical vulnerability, you can still take other mitigating steps. And having that visibility into what's in your system is going to be critical, especially as we get a more and more complex and interconnected internet architecture and fabric, and into the 5G space, where there are going to be more and more layers. If we want that to be open source, then having some understanding of what is the software that's there, is it up to date, is it the software that I think it is, that's going to be absolutely critical to having a trustworthy infrastructure.
You had to go drop an S-bomb. Software bill of materials. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that we generally share the same kinds of information, and I think that the Cyber Information Sharing Act 2015 was what was needed at the time to help facilitate it. I still think we deal with challenges in terms of as you talked about, Danny, both the life cycle around the data. Frankly, I've taken a stance where, based on the date that we get the information, we just start an aging process unless we see activity related to it, in which case we reset the date, but we just age things off ourselves, because it is a problem, and people are rarely willing to say, no, it's not a problem, because what we see is imperfect, right? But I do think that we need to continue to share more quickly, but also make sure that the highest quality stuff's going out. Frequently, I get data weeks after it's valuable, and by then the attackers have moved on. And so I think that's more of a procedural challenge than a policy challenge at this point.
Final question on this. Do you find that in these forums that there are enough participants, or do we need to create mechanisms to let them know about it and encourage their participation? Do they see the value proposition? Is there any way we can increase participation in these groups?
I think there are, I was going to say two classes of people, but I hate when people do that. So, but I do think, yeah, exactly, those that do and that don't. But I think broadly there are organizations who have the capability to deal with the raw information, turn it into something that's actionable, and act based on it. And frankly, I would love for that to be cheaper and easier. But it's expensive, it's time consuming. You need people who are going to go read the reports, go find that IP address at the end, make sure they understand the context of it, decide whether they should take action. We're just not or establish even for automated feeds, make sure that they've got the flow going, that things are aging off and so forth. There's work involved. And we're in a talent shortage in cybersecurity that's immense. And so there are other organizations that don't have the resources to put there. And I think that's okay. I think it's important for organizations to understand whether they can afford to invest in that kind of infrastructure or whether they want to be a consumer. One of the things that we frequently talk about is I don't have a large team that is building a CenturyLink, our own capability on email protection. I tend to use other people who've specialized that and built a deep knowledge and a deep expertise on email protection. And in that sense, I've decided, hey, I'm not going to take the limited cybersecurity talent I have and deploy them in an area that I've decided I'm not going to create that expertise in. Now, you want to talk about DDoS attacks, you want to talk about threat intelligence, those kinds of things. Very different conversations. I'm doubling down, I'm putting extra expertise in there. And so I think it's important for all organizations to be able to choose whether they need to interact in those avenues, in which case they should be an active participant, put information in, take it out, act on it, or whether they should be consumers of a service where somebody else is doing that, and they should be making sure that that service provides that capability.
Before I go to Ram, I'm just going to give the audience a heads up. After this round of questions, put your hand up and we'll take it to the audience.
Thanks, Melinda. I think we've got a couple of things here. We've got some solutions defined, and pretty much anybody who is in cybersecurity will tell you that it's a flywheel. You have to have data coming in, you have to process it, you have to find a way to get that cycle back in, and use that in a continuous cycle to just get better. And to do that, you have to have folks who are trustworthy. And typically where this thing breaks down is a function of trust. Who do I actually trust to share the information, and what are they going to do with the information once I share it with them? And I think some of the unique challenges here have to do both with corporate boundaries and jurisdictional geographic boundaries. And while the internet does not respect either of them, as people who work at these places and who are citizens of countries, we have to deal with that. And I think that really, in many ways, is one of the root causes for why collaboration and cooperation, you hear more talk about it than you actually see happen. And the places where it, at least in my experience, where I've seen it work, has been where it's been some kind of a secret handshake society. Because then you are kind of intentionally setting aside both corporate and jurisdictional boundaries, because you are with like-minded people who believe that interoperable internet is actually the bigger and more important thing. I mean, ISOC, the Internet Society, is doing quite a bit of work in this area. They have this OTA and other things in there, but they're starting to poke at some of these important areas that are young and need a lot more discussion to make it real.
Thanks for the panel. My name is Li Yang. I think you people are really almost touched, but I think somewhere is you people stop right there. For instance, you are talking about integrity or accountability. You are almost there, but the problem now is that profit over people. Almost every government agency is involved in some kind of misconduct. They change people's information, identification, even the whole file change to a different agencies. And then in the government now, they don't have a good personnel with good integrity to protect individuals' information. They say that, and instead, they don't use what I call overqualified personnel. Instead, they use somebody maybe disabled and then go hacking or everything like that. So if you are a customer, if you are a contractor with government, you are able to discover all this funny data or personnel. So would you be able to expose them to the public so they will be discouraged to do that, or they should be fired? Instead of they are there living like a king, and then personnel will be good employee will be fired or somehow get lost.
So I can't speak to exactly this question, but I can say that you hit on a huge point, which is how do we get good cybersecurity talent into the U.S. government? So that is a really important challenge. There are a number of ongoing efforts across the U.S. government. In the Department of Commerce, we have NICE, which is the National Something Cybersecurity Education. Really should know that acronym better. Is anyone helping with the NICE initiative? So anyway, it's a phenomenal initiative. It's just not one that I work on. There's also a great point for anyone who's a student in the room. There's something called the Scholarship for Service Initiative that's run out of DHS, where if you're interested in studying cybersecurity, one of those leading areas, for an advanced undergrad or a master's degree, for every year the government will pay for your education, and then you owe the U.S. federal government a year to work on these important security challenges. So it's a great program, and I encourage anyone who is working with students to be aware of it. There are a large number of universities across the U.S. that are involved in it. So I think you hit on a point. Talent in cybersecurity, huge issue. In the U.S. government, even harder because we don't pay that well.
I'll just say something really quickly to that is I think that accountability and transparency related to personal information is really important as well. And so I believe we've kind of reached an inflection point in all the world, I guess, for what personal information is and what people do with it and how they handle it and how they need to be more transparent and accountable for mishandling it. And I think that we're probably going to swing really far to the right and then find somewhere back in the middle that's acceptable, hopefully. But I think that that'll also help as well.
Yeah. I do this video thing, and on Tuesday I was doing shot at Amazon Web Services in New York, and they had an event on a group called HackerOne, and they had these hackers who, they make a living off getting bug bounties. And so what I wanted to get into is incentives and how you think incentives can work into this, and even down to the level where if you're a member of the public, user of CenturyLink, if you get a bit of phishing and you report it up, you get something back saying at least a thumbs up or well done that you can, and also the problem was that a lot of the times why they needed this organization was that they couldn't report the hacks to the companies because there isn't the method to report that stuff.
That's a great question. Yeah, and out of curiosity, do the Scouts have a cybersecurity badge?
The Girl Scouts do.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
I forget who said it was Palo Alto, right?
Yeah, McLaughlin.
Yeah, McLaughlin. Yeah.
You're going to comment on the hacker?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So sorry, I lost track. Got distracted. So yeah, I've worked with HackerOne a lot over the years. I think it is neat to have an incentive program. I think there is a good use for those kind of crowdsourced bounty bug finding as part of the overall security tapestry. And so I think it's a clever way to use talent that's motivated in a certain way and to allow people to do things. So I've known Alex for many years, and it is a fun and exciting program.
Yeah, so I was just going to pile onto that one and say I'm a big fan of bug bounty programs. We've had them for many years as well, and we certainly have our internal teams: red team, blue team, purple team. We have lots of people giving us various information. From a crowdsource or open source perspective, but also motivating people financially and saying, hey, here's an incentive where if you see something with my infrastructure, please tell me before it's compromised in some manner, because I'm not going to see everything. We have global infrastructure. And so that we can do something more proactive is it's a good thing for those folks, no matter where you are globally, and it certainly helps us better fortify our infrastructure. So I think those are really, really valuable programs, and yeah, I know a lot of those folks as well.
Hi, thank you all so much. So as a super cautious cybersecurity person, I was shocked that I actually safely gave my information, and lots of my privacy was compromised because of my own doing. I never click on anything. I hover over every email. So I'm trying to figure out how on earth do I prevent this? Because I always make sure everything is certified, secured, and yet I still fell victim to this. So you guys mentioned that scenario earlier. What do we do if it happens to us even?
And the basic hygiene is there, which is make sure that a single compromise of a credential doesn't lead to a chain catastrophe. Like that's the real danger. So a password manager, and there are a bunch of ways that you can sort of build that in trust. Folks aren't going to have a password manager. Make sure that your email password is different from every other, things like that. And then the other approach is use up-to-date electronics and up-to-date systems. I'm going to be heading out to DEF CON in a few weeks. I'm not bringing a burner phone. It's a dangerous thing to say on camera, I suppose. But on the other hand, it's one of the most heavily surveilled environments, and so the chances of someone compromising a completely up-to-date iPhone is pretty small. Like that's a very expensive thing to use against little old me. So make sure. Obviously, herd immunity is dangerous, but what you can do is make sure that you have up-to-date technology.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. I would venture a guess that everybody in this room's confidential information of some sort has been compromised in a breach somewhere, or via information sharing, right, partnerships and other things. And so certainly, the auto updates, all those kinds of things. If it's financial information, then certainly, lock your credit, that kind of thing, right? Just sort of good basic stuff and get alerting on that. And I guess the other thing is I would, enduring communications, this wasn't as much of a problem, and now we have really enduring communications, photographs, healthcare data, more things that are emitted from IoT and the like. And so understanding what that information is and where it's going and where it lives and who has custody of it and what they do to protect it is an important question to ask. And so, I think those are great questions. There are some resources. I think Internet Society has some resources. I think NTIA has some resources on your site for consumers as well, right? And so, I think that's, at the end of the day, that's kind of the crux of the issue for most folks. So,
this is Ram. Small things like protecting your privacy when you're browsing, using, EFF has Privacy Badger, you have, tools like that, that protect you. Those are small things. Now, you give up some convenience in return, right? If you have an ad blocker or if you have, something like Privacy Badger on your system, you give up some convenience, but in return, you're actually taking control of your private data and you're not letting your data migrate from one browsing experience to the next browsing experience without you knowing about it.
I see we've got the mic in the back there for Kat. We'll do one more.
Hi, my name's Kat Blake. I'm the Senior Program Manager at Next Century Cities, and I was involved in yesterday's IGF Youth Day Zero, and we had a couple of breakout sessions about different topics, and one of the things we talked about was the youth perspective on encryption. And we had two conclusions that were kind of in tension with one another. The first was that youth, as I'm sure many other stakeholders, are particularly concerned about the security of personal data, both for personal privacy reasons and also for safety reasons. And so for that reason, we were all in strong support of stronger encryption. But we also, for similar safety reasons, wanted there to be some sort of mechanism for law enforcement and other entities to be able to access data in an emergency situation. And so we brainstormed a couple of ideas about how those two things might live together, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm happy to chat off camera.
I'd personally love to hear more. So it'd be great to hear the ideas. Allan and I've had a number of these conversations in different venues over time, so I'm really curious. This would be great.
Okay. All right, we'll take one final question here.
Okay. So Danny mentioned privacy, and two things have not really been mentioned, GDPR or who is. Now I have,
Yeah.
and I like to hear what you guys think about
welcome. You're welcome, yeah, is the answer, yeah. All right, well, I want to thank everybody for coming today and taking some time. You're welcome. I want to thank our panelists. This is a really great discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.